Britain's conversation, The Nigel Farage Show.
Mr. Nigel Farage.
Thank you, Donald, and good evening, everybody. Well, I'm here in Strasbourg, where Euro MPs meet after the long summer break for a week of debates, including on Wednesday, Jean-Claude Juncker, EU Commission President, will give his State of the Union speech. It'll be interesting to see whether he talks about Brexit. He says that he won't. Equally, will he talk about the growing populist revolt, call it what you will, because it is happening, and yesterday it happened in Sweden, because as a result of their general election, the centre-left bloc have about 40% of the vote, the centre-right bloc have around about 40% of the vote, and with 18% of the vote, up from 13 last time, are the Swedish Democrats. Now, this is a party whose roots, going back to the 1980s, are pretty national socialist, but they've cleaned up the act. They've expelled hundreds of members of their party, people who've made appalling comments on Twitter and Facebook and elsewhere. And they fought this on a ticket, saying that, frankly, they've had enough of asylum seekers coming into the country. Sweden has a population of 10 million. Nearly 1 million migrants have come into that country over the course of the last 10 years. So, pro rata, they've accepted more than anybody, and they've taken more of the burden from what Mrs. Merkel had to say than any other country outside Germany. Equally, they were also campaigning for a referendum on Sweden's membership of the European Union. So this is an anti-EU party calling for a stop to the current asylum and immigration policy that is going on in Sweden. Now, given that over the course of the last few months we've seen cars burning in their hundreds in city centres, we've seen shocking crime figures, particularly from cities like Malmö, and I'm talking about a huge increase in sexual violence, a huge increase in murder. Actually, the 18% that the Swedish Democrats got wasn't a particularly stunning result. They were actually polling in the mid-20s and maybe even slightly higher a few months ago. But what happened was actually many of the other parties began to take on the same message, at least on immigration, saying we're going to cut numbers. But nonetheless, what happened in Sweden yesterday, and bear in mind, this has always been considered to be the most liberal country in Europe. It's part of a bigger overall trend. Virtually every country now has a rising Eurosceptic movement, and the one that I would really point you to is Italy, where the Lega, the League, led by Matteo Salvini, who scored 17% in that general election earlier this year, which that was considered to be an amazing result, given that party was on its back at 2% just 5 years before. In polls this weekend, the League are now on 35%, with the Five Star Movement equally with some strong Eurosceptic messages on 30%. So what's happening? What is going on? Why do you think there is a growing resentment in Europe of the European Union? And I wonder, Mr. Juncker, are you going to address this on Thursday? Because I tell you what, I am in my speech. So what do you think, folks? Is it simply down to immigration? If it is, call me on 0345 6060 973. Is it about economics? If you think that, text to 84850. Or is it about resistance against rule from Brussels? Brussels looking a bit authoritarian, a bit of a bully boy. If that's how you feel, please tweet. Using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC. And as ever, you can watch on Facebook and comment there too. I'll give you my take very quickly. This is about immigration more than any other factor. The decision of Jean-Claude Juncker in 2015 to put in place the EU's common asylum policy, which basically meant that anybody that landed on southern European shores coming across the Mediterranean would be allowed to stay. That, of course, was hugely inflated by Angela Merkel saying, we can cope. As many as want to come can come. And it's that has led to such huge resentment. Because people say, hang on, we're seeing our towns and cities changing here, almost beyond recognition in some places. Nobody ever asked us about this. We've never voted on this. And there is a great sense of resentment. So I think immigration and culture is absolutely the number one reason why this is happening. Secondly, it is about authoritarian rule from Brussels. Tomorrow, Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, who has already said to the EU's migrant quotas, no, we're not going to take anybody, he's going to be here in the European Parliament tomorrow, where he'll be treated at best like a naughty schoolboy, at worst like an evil tyrant, despite the fact he's democratically elected with a massive parliamentary majority. And they're talking now about applying Article 7 to Hungary, as they're doing to Poland, which means they'll strip them of their voting rights and stop sending them money. I think the second reason for this is authoritarian rule from Brussels by people that you can't vote for and you can't remove. And right at the bottom is economic circumstances. Now look, we can go to countries in the Mediterranean where youth unemployment is still 30 to 50%. Normally, big political change happens when you've got tough economic circumstances. The remarkable thing about the rise of Eurosceptics, the rise of populism, choose your term as you see appropriate, the remarkable thing is it's happened during a couple of years of relatively benign economics. And when the next big downturn comes, and it will, because stock markets are there at all-time highs, much of them based on companies that produce ideas and not products. When it comes, once again, the debt crisis will come back and hit, because actually national borrowing, corporate borrowing and individual borrowing is even bigger than it was back in 2008 when we had those huge problems. So my view is that it's for cultural reasons this is happening, but when we get the economic downturn, I think this will actually reach a level where there'll be several other countries that will be having referendums on staying part of this union. Tell me I'm right, tell me I'm wrong. That's my view, that's my take. I think it's remarkable that this is happening at a time of benign economics within the Eurozone. Let's go to Jonathan in Glasgow, who is a new caller to this show. Jonathan, good evening.
Hello, Nigel. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. So, I think all of us would have to admit, whether we were pro-EU or anti-Jonathan, that there is a big rise in Euroscepticism.
Definitely. I think you're absolutely correct. I think the big reason it's a reaction against the massive uncontrolled immigration into Europe, and there's no two ways about it. People have had enough. The crime statistics, like you're saying, go through the roof. Sex crime, sex attacks, and also the amount of state money that these people are claiming as well. People are just, they're sick of it now. And I was a bit surprised when I said it did get such a low percentage. I thought they were maybe going to go up to the mid-20s as well.
Well, Jonathan, they were on course for that. I have to be honest, I don't think they fought a very good, clear campaign. They were up in the polls, they decided to start playing safe, and if you defend a lead in sport or in politics, it tends to evaporate. But equally, Jonathan, they have changed the centre of gravity of the whole debate in Sweden on immigration. So other parties were getting votes from the Swedish Democrats by promising to be tough. But either way, it's still an advance, and it's still part of this big overall picture, isn't it?
I think they're the only people. In this country, we've got no major political party will make a stand against massive uncontrolled immigration. At least they're actually making the stand against it. When I watch
Jonathan, since the decline in UKIP in the opinion polls, and I'll talk a bit more about UKIP later on in this hour, but since the decline of UKIP in the polls, it's conveniently become a word, immigration, that the Conservatives and Labour don't even talk about, and yet I think people in the country do care. Jonathan, when people vote for the Swedish Democrats, for argument's sake, a party that does have undoubtedly a dark and murky past, does that make them racist for doing so?
No, absolutely not. I think you're the only person I've heard on the radio use the term National Socialist, which is the correct term for the so-called Nazis. Every day I hear this Nazi, far right, extreme right. The National Socialists are a party of the left, right? So that whole idea of it being against immigration is somehow a far right.
Well, it's kind of where the circle meets, Jonathan, isn't it? Far left and far right meet, and they are pretty much the same thing. Jonathan, thank you. Let's go to Jason in Sutton, the regular caller to this show. Jason, good evening.
How are you, Nigel? I hope you're doing well.
I'm doing all right. I'm looking at my friend Matteo Salvini, who I know very well. 35% in the opinion polls. He and his Eurosceptic partners now on 65% of the vote in Italy. Why is it happening, Jason?
So I'm glad you're over all the abuse that you received for being a bigoted racist then when you were in Australia and New Zealand, but that's beside the point.
Do you know, Jason, hang on. This is really interesting. Very, very good comment, I thought, today. from Trevor Kavanagh in The Sun. He says, automatically, when people vote this way and make these arguments, they are decried as being racist. Actually, these voters are neither fascist nor Nazi. They're just angry about what's happening to their countries.
Well, if you look at the vote yesterday, just in Sweden, 1 in 6 people voted for the far-right party that you're supporting.
Well, 1 in 5.
1 in 6. 83%, over 83% actually deliberately chose not to vote for that far-right racist party that wants to leave the European Union. The way you twist the facts is crazy. UKIP in the UK, you've been...
Hang on, Jason. I have not twisted the facts. I have said from the start of this show that actually the showing of the Swedish Democrats was nowhere near as dramatic as some commentators are pointing out, but it is part of a trend across Europe. I'm asking you, Jason, do you think the rise... And you'd call them populist, I'm sure. Do you think the rise of populist parties is because the people that vote for them are inherently racist?
I wouldn't call them populist at all, actually, Nigel, so please don't put words in my mouth. But if you look at it, I can't think of a single far-right party like UKIP.
UKIP's far-right now, is it? Oh, gosh, very good.
Like the ones that you support and you speak on the same platforms as across the entire Europe. I can't think of a single one that's got more than 1 in 6 votes or 1 in 5 votes at the very, very best.
Let's just try this one more. I tell you what, Jason, we'll try this one more time. We'll try this one more time. Salvini's on 35% and the Five-Star are on 30%. Something fundamentally radical is happening in Italian politics. You're a supporter of this European project. Mr. Juncker's got to get up and give a speech about this on Wednesday. Do you have any idea why they're turning against the mainstream in Italy?
Look at their record. Have either of them suggested it would be a great idea to leave the European Union?
They're talking now.
Everybody can see what a disaster Brexit is. Everybody can see. Everybody. And yet you sit there on the radio preaching to your fanatic followers that you're talking absolute rubbish. You are about to
all right, Jason, I'm talking rubbish. There's no rise in Euroscepticism in Europe. Everybody is happy as Larry with the European project. Is that what you're telling me?
Again, you're putting everybody no.
Well, tell me.
No more than 20% of the people...
Well, there's 65% in Italy, Jason. I've tried my best. I've lost. I can't help it. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. It's now 6:15. And Prime Minister Stefan Löfven of Sweden has got a hell of a job to try and put together a coalition because the centre-left are on 40%, the centre-right are on 40%, and the Swedish Democrats, the Eurosceptic anti-immigration party, are on 18% of the vote, up from 13% last time. So it's going to take a long time, I think, to form a coalition. So the Swedish Democrats hold the balance of power. Either side could do a deal with them to govern, but I promise you nobody is going to do that. They will be left out very much in the cold. Of that I'm certain, but right across Europe, Euroscepticism is rising. I'm asking you what you think the reasons are. Laura in Schoenfield says it's about one word, immigration. Dave in Wimbledon says, don't lose sight of the fact 82% of Swedes supported centrist parties. The people are clearly not with the far right. Dave, I made the point earlier that they were above 25% of the vote, but the other parties started talking about getting tough on immigration, and that did make a big difference. Jeff says, if you're outside the EU, you can respond to changes in the marketplace quicker. You've got to be quick on your feet these days to respond to market forces, not tied down by a bureaucratic organisation like the EU. And that very much an argument, Jeff, that Salvini and others in Italy are making. They're saying, look, we're having so much of our economic life determined somewhere else. Surely better that we do it and make our own decisions. Let's go to Sweden. Let's go to Gothenburg, to Dean, who's a new caller. Good evening, Dean.
Good evening, Nigel. Great to be on the programme.
Very good to have you on. So, in a sense, it wasn't quite the earthquake that some thought it would be, was it?
No, it wasn't. And then, obviously, the polling was pretty high, but they're pretty hard to read, apparently, the Swedish Democrats, because lots of people are still quite afraid to say that they agree with them. Do you understand?
Oh, no, I do. I mean, shy Trump voters, shy UKIP voters, shy Brexit voters. I'm sure it's the same with the Swedish Democrats. But either way, Dean, I mean, the whole thing, effectively, Parliament is numerically pretty stalemated now, isn't it?
It is. We're definitely not going to talk to them or allow them in. But at the local level, there's a lot more across the across the board. They talk to each other to get things done, but they're pretty steadfast, all of them. So they just have to start listening to the people a little bit. If you look at South Sweden, that's totally yellow. That's totally Sweden Democrat, but they're sort of the areas that are having to put up with the influx of people.
And that's Malmö and
after.
places like that. Yeah.
They're not racist, but they get branded as racist because it is such a thing.
Dean, are you still there? But we're going to get Dean back, because I wanted to find out more about his neighbours who started to vote for the Swedish Democrats and why. Let's go to Anna in Welwyn Garden City. Anna, good evening to you.
Good evening to you, Nigel. Thank you for taking my call. I've been listening to this debate quite carefully.
So, and Euroscepticism, Anna, is rising, whatever people think. What's going on in your opinion?
Well, I've had this sort of general view in my head for quite some time, regardless of how Sweden have voted yesterday. Mm-hmm. And I can see, this is quite a generalised view of mine, in effect. I see that we in fact are all European. I mean, we've come from Norway, or our ancestors have come from Norway or Italy, like me, because I'm half Italian. And I think what's happened is this entity, this European Union, has come up under our noses. Because I can assure you, a lot of people really weren't aware what they actually did. And the rules that they have embedded, and like, for instance, with the Brexit situation, whereas they will not budge on the main principles because they don't want to undermine the single market, the customs union. I think what the problem is because where it's so rigid and there's no flexibility, you are definitely going to have a situation with the human race and us as a species. If you're confined to an all-four, sort of like in a room and you can't get out, there is going to be cracks. And this is what's happening. This is what's happening to everyone. And I can feel where there is no flexibility in their union, in their rules or regulations, you're going to have this situation. And the people behind this who set this project up in a sense didn't factor that in, you see. They didn't factor that issue in.
So, Anna, given your analysis then, you think that Euroscepticism will grow over the course of the next few years, not diminish?
It's like you have a crack, it'll only get bigger.
Change or die. No, I get that. Anna, thank you. How well I remember, after the referendum, meeting Monsieur Barnier, he said, Nigel, we've learnt the lessons of the referendum, by which he meant we're going to centralise even more quickly. They just don't get it. We're going back to Gothenburg to speak to Dean, who promises us he's now on a clear line. Hi, Dean.
Hello there. I live in the middle of the country, so we haven't got coverage here.
Right, so at least where you live there are no riots, because we've seen pictures, Dean, in the last few weeks of cars by the hundred being burnt over the course of weeks in big city centres. Dean, do you know people who've gone from the so-called political mainstream to the Swedish Democrats?
Yeah, well, lots of people, like I say, they don't talk about it much, but I managed to get people to open up to me. But there are a lot of people that want them to have influence over certain things that the government's doing. I don't think they think that they can run the country yet, but yeah, it doesn't help when there's burning of cars. Well, that's quite a tradition. It's quite a well-planned thing.
Tradition?
But
Dean, but Dean, I used to go to Stockholm in the 90s when I had a proper job before politics, and it was the most relaxed city I've ever been to.
Yeah, it's such a shame that it's changing, but I think they can do something about it. But they all have to talk to each other. That's the trouble. I had the same view when I moved here in 92, 93. It is a well-run country, or was, or it is. It's still a beautiful country. They just have to, just open their eyes a little bit, and if they want to help people, don't help too many all at once. That's the only pressure they put on the systems, is that they've taken in too many at once. But hopefully they'll get it sorted.
OK, Dean, thank you very much indeed for your call. Dean has lived there since 92 and he's seen great change. Watson says to me by text, if Italy are so Eurosceptic, when will they leave the EU? The answer is never. They're not that stupid. They've seen the mess you have caused in the UK. Oh, look, I haven't caused any mess in the UK. Theresa May has caused quite a mess in the UK. Brexit's not difficult. And of course the truth of it is, and this I do know from my position here in Strasbourg, if we're seen a couple of years down the road to have made a success of Brexit, it is the end of of the European project, which is why they are fighting so hard and being as tough as they are with Mrs May. Just a shame that she seems to buckle. Toby is calling from Reading. Toby, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. I hope you're well.
I am well, and to me, Toby, it seems pretty obvious that people in democratic nation states would object to their borders being opened up by somebody else and being told what to do by foreign bureaucrats. I mean, to me, it's obvious, but what do you think?
Yeah, well, I think people in general, often we don't like being told what to do. We still have to abide by certain rules, obviously. But I think that there's a simple way of looking at it, and imagine you get into a car. You have to be able to control the speed of that car. It's a big thing. It's moving fast. And if you're not in control, you'll start getting a bit scared. And maybe if you're a fellow passenger, you might get angry with the person driving because they're not controlling the car properly. So if you do that to immigration policy, etc., and you start speeding it up, ramping it up very quickly, that means, of course, that things in countries will change very quickly. And people then get scared because they get into scenarios that they don't really know. They're not familiar with them.
They're not in control, Toby. They're not at the wheel, are they? That's exactly the point. I mean, that is the basic sovereignty argument, really, isn't it?
Yeah, well, you can take a house. You know, we love having friends and family over and so on, and acquaintances, and maybe even people we don't know that well. But it can't be too many, and it can't be all the time. So I think people we're fairly simple in that sense. We like being with other people, but it's this whole thing of we need to have some common ground as well. But I do also know a fair few things about Swedes, and I'd say the politicians are a little bit scared. They're kind of hiding away from the problem in Sweden, and they won't really even talk to the Swedish Democrats. And as you said, you can have a dark past, which they certainly do in the Swedish Democrats, but imagine having a dark present, like the things you might see in say, the Labour Party with anti-Semitism.
Well, that's very true. No, it is quite funny, isn't it, that we throw these terms like far right and appalling human beings, and there are, I think, quite a few people who phoned into this show over the last few months who think the Labour Party is an even bigger worry. Toby, I thank you very much indeed for your call. Paul says, looks like Barnier finally gets it. The EU's days are numbered. Talk in Brussels that Britain getting a deal is becoming easier. Of course they'll accept Chequers here. They'll accept Chequers because it's a complete humiliation and total and utter climb down. But actually, we could do a Canada-style trade deal if only we had a leader with the courage to go for it. Frankly, German industry couldn't refuse. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show, exclusive at LBC. It's now 6:30 and time. Whether you go to Hungary, to Denmark, whether you go to Poland, to Germany, to Italy, country after country has seen the rise of Eurosceptic and what we call populist movements. What happened yesterday in Sweden wasn't dramatic, but the Swedish Democrats, with 18% of the vote, do actually now hold the balance of power in that country, and they're changing the entire national debate on immigration in Sweden. I'm asking you, why are these things happening? Before I get back to that, there is a really extraordinary comment that's been made today by Steve Baker, the former Brexit minister, and he talks about Chequers, and we're now told there are up to 80 Conservative members of Parliament that will vote against Chequers. And wouldn't it be funny if Mrs May got Chequers through with Labour support, because it kept us effectively part of the single market and customs union for goods? And he's warning, Steve Baker, of a catastrophic split in the Conservative Party. Right? You hear words like this, I think he might be right. I actually think at last he may be right. Someone may be right in saying that a genuine split could happen. And this is happening at the same time that Labour are still completely at war with each other, with Chuka Umunna over the weekend calling his own party racist. I can never in my life think of a time when the two leading parties have been in such a state of civil war. And on Brexit, the one party that really should be benefiting hugely from this should be UKIP. It should be picking up Tory voters and Labour voters, and instead they've decided, at their conference in Birmingham to discuss, amongst other things, whether there should be a rule change. These are the rules that I brought in to stop people who've been part of prescribed far-right organisations joining UKIP. They're going to have a debate about whether Tommy Robinson should be allowed to join UKIP with a rule change. And I kind of think maybe UKIP are missing a little bit of a trick here, because there are millions of very unhappy Eurosceptic voters out there in both parties. On Facebook, Dave says, Nigel, I'm a US citizen. It looks like the EU got too large for its intended mandate. It's trying to overrule national governments, get back to the EEC, and they'd serve their constituents better. A lot of people, Dave, feel like that. But here's the argument. In the face of Brexit and growing Euroscepticism, would the European Union reform, start to hand back powers to member states? No, it's the opposite. I bet you. We'll hear from Juncker on Wednesday a reiteration of the need for the European army to be completed by 2025. We'll hear once again there needs to be a Eurozone minister with the power to intervene and override national governments within their own economies. No, their message from all of this is we have to centralise even more quickly. A bit like the communists in Soviet Union when it wasn't really working. And they said, we know what the problem is. Not enough communism. Let's have more of it. They've drawn very much the same conclusion. Kelsey in Harpenden has a different view and thinks that the Swedish vote is due to resentment that corporations across Europe are not paying reasonable taxes on their profits. That is a resentment, but I would argue immigration was a much bigger one in terms of what happened yesterday in Sweden. Let's go to Colchester and speak to Lawrence. Lawrence, good evening.
Good evening to you, sir, the man that hasn't been knighted yet, but bear with me.
No! I think that's a long way off, Lawrence, I have to say. But I mean, I'm more likely when Mrs. May to sort of be deported somewhere, I'd have thought, than knighted. But hey. So, Lawrence, it wasn't dramatic yesterday in Sweden, but it was still a move in the same direction. Why is Europe turning against the EU?
People are afraid, Nigel. They are afraid with their identities of their countries being eroded away. In Brexit, in the United Kingdom, people voted for their sovereignty and immigration. Simple as that. Now, the problems in this country now, you've got the far right growing throughout Europe, and it does frighten me. History is beginning to repeat itself. Slowly, but it is repeating itself.
Well, the most horrendous thing, Lawrence, the most horrendous thing I saw over the weekend was that Jewish business in Chemnitz in eastern Germany, a Jewish business, attacked by about a dozen people, signs defaced, rocks thrown through windows. I mean, to think that Jewish businesses in Germany are being attacked again does say something very disturbing, doesn't it?
Well, I work for a lot of Jewish people in Finchley, and I live, as you know, in Colchester, and the Jewish community are buying up properties and schools for their religion, because they want to get out of London because they feel threatened. And when you've got a fascist like Corbyn, the Jew hater, and that's what his party stands for. It's not.
Well, that's a bit strong, Lawrence. It's a bit strong, but he certainly mixed with some people who would fit that description.
Absolutely. Well, I'm a realist, Nigel. Look at history that doesn't get taught in the schools anymore because it's not PC, and you can see this is the beginning of hatred, and that is why the far right throughout Europe is growing. Now, I sent my MP, Bernard Jenkins, an email about this the other day. I picked a paper up at the Daily Mail, see what you like about it, but there's an article in there of a lady in a full burqa, and she applied for a job in a Scouts club.
I saw this, yeah.
Did you see that?
I did see this, yeah. And I did see this, and there was an argument about kayaking and safety. The guy was seen to have made a derogatory comment. I mean, Lawrence, you talked earlier in this conversation about people's identity.
Yes.
Do you think across Europe that a lot of this has to do, actually, and what happened in Chemnitz was appalling, but in general terms, if I listen to Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, I'll be with him tomorrow in my chamber here, he says, we want to protect our Judeo-Christian culture. Isn't that at the root of isn't that at the root of much of the objection from Central Europe to the European project? Because actually, we've opened up the doors to a very large number of people from a different religion.
Yes.
Well, Lawrence, I agree with you. Thank you. I'm going to move on. But certainly in Central Europe, that is a big, big thing. Alan's a new caller from Bedford. Alan, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. Can I open with a little anecdote? I found out this morning that I've been blocked by Mr. James O'Brien on Twitter, and I'm a bit upset about that. I hope he will be able to take a look and find out whether he is justified.
I'm not going to get involved in domestic disputes between you and James O'Brien, Alan. But
fair point. Fair point. It was really just to help me calm my nerves a little bit, because this is quite a big thing for me.
You're very welcome, and just think of it. And don't be nervous. We're just having a chat. It could even be over a beer, Alan. It's not, but it could be.
Okay, cheers, and I would certainly enjoy that. Let me say that I think there's a few things which are influencing the way people think about immigration, and obviously there are different ways of looking at it, but I'm going to give you one example or one way to look at it which you can either agree with or disagree with. I think that one aspect of it is people's fears, and I think even your last caller mentioned that people are afraid.
Yep.
And I think that, for example, if you then take a look at the technology we've got available today, the way that you can communicate in all kinds of ways, social media, and then if you talk about the way politics is developing, and the way that there are certain groups of people who've got certain policies, and they're trying to use new ways of communicating with people using this technology. Now, the metaphor I want to use is I've got a scratch on my thumb, and if I put a plaster on that, it's going to get better. But if I sort of scratch at it and I, rub it in a bit of dirt and I mess about with it and I start feeding in lots of different, antibodies, bacteria or whatever, it's going to get worse and worse. And eventually, it's going to make my hand get really quite bad, and then if you keep working on it and really, working away, you might actually end up with gangrene on the arm, and so the whole of your arm has been infected. So what I'm trying to say is that if you take people's fears and you understand a little bit about what makes them uncomfortable, you can make them feel much more uncomfortable if you feed them with the right information. And I believe that there is a lot of that going on right now.
Yeah, I mean, clearly in politics, Alan, whatever side of politics people are on, they will exaggerate in how they communicate people's hopes and fears. That is the way the world works, and it works that way in the commercial world too. Do you think, Alan, in the case, of Sweden or Hungary or whatever it is, do you think people's fears of mass immigration are justified or not?
That's a binary question, and I would like to answer it a bit more nuanced.
Well, Alan, I tell you what, there is no simple answer, is there? I know. But do you let me just ask you this one last question, Alan, and we've got to move on. Do you understand why people are fearful of huge social change going on in their cities?
I have an understanding. I have some historical background of growing up in an area where there's immigration, so I understand why some people have some fears, but I think those fears can be alleviated by the right policies of government to actually make sure we...
Okay, well, that's exactly the same point that Dean from Gothenburg made. We've made a hell of a mess of this. We've really hashed it up, but we could get back on track. Alan, I thank you very much indeed for your call. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. It's now 6:45. Well, we're discussing the Swedish elections, the rise of Euroscepticism and the reasons behind it. Before that, just quickly, the Boundary Commission has published its final recommendations for new parliamentary boundaries in England. And the idea is that you would have every constituency representing roughly the same number of voters. Sounds fair, sounds reasonable, and the total number of MPs will be cut down to 600. Again, doesn't sound wholly unreasonable to me. At the moment, the Labour Party have a massive advantage because so many of the inner city seats that they hold have seen depopulation, whereas you go outside of the big cities and a lot of people have moved out there and in fact now often commute back to work in the cities in which they originally lived. Interestingly, under these proposals, the Conservatives at the last election would have had a majority of 13, and Jeremy Corbyn's seat wouldn't exist. Are MPs going to vote for fewer MPs to be there in Parliament? Well, I kind of think that's a bit like asking turkeys to vote for Christmas. There aren't many people that vote to get rid of their jobs. I did, but I cannot see it happening, even though it would be a lot better and fairer if it did. Back to the rise of Euroscepticism, John says, why is it Remainers can hold an entire conversation and never mention Greece, bankrupted by the EU and in the euro? John, biggest mistake they ever made, joining that currency, and I think the Italians are beginning to come to that conclusion too. They're not quite there yet, but they're on their way. Let's go to Mick in Bath. Mick, good evening to you.
Good evening, Nigel. Thanks for taking my call. I was listening to the Swedish result, and I just thought I'd ring in and tell you that I don't think this is not solely about immigration. It's about mass immigration.
Yes, okay, no, fair point.
That's their problem.
Yeah.
It's not, and it's also not about having a voice. And I feel people have a feeling that there's no representation anymore, and that's why people are moving away. And the EU are just looking like Big Brother to me.
Yeah, well, that increasingly is how people are feeling, and well, I'll certainly see that face to face with Mr. Orbán from Hungary tomorrow. Mick, you're quite right in saying what you said. Do you know, in 1999, when I was first elected to this place, in all my election material, the word immigration did not appear once. Why? Because it wasn't an issue. You know, we'd had a very settled net migration policy over the course of the previous decades. It wasn't until the EU expanded, Mick, led in former communist countries, that saw this huge inflow into our country and then compounded it all by saying, as Mrs. Merkel did, anyone can come. So, Mick, I agree with you. It is not about immigration per se.
No, it's the mass immigration. But you see, what they're trying to do is they're trying to sort of put a cap on this. And the more they sort of ignore people's feelings, people will turn to extreme parties. And you'll find this is going to happen. I've been predicting this for years, actually. And it's happening now, and to a small scale. But if it's not corrected, Nigel, it will get worse and worse. Yep. And I can see the whole thing collapsing, as you do. And that derogatory term we always get, populist. I was doing some work this afternoon. I just got the Oxford Dictionary here. And here, this is what the explanation is. Appealing to the general public, widely favoured or admired. So if I'm a populist, I'm really pleased about it.
No, it was Mr. Barroso, the previous Commission President, first started referring to me as a populist 10 years ago. I said to him privately one day, no, I'm not a populist, but the policies are becoming increasingly popular. He didn't seem to like that very much. Mick, you're right. Unless they learn the lesson, within the European Union, this rebellion will grow and in the end subsume and destroy the whole thing. Thank you, Mick. Let's listen to what Jean-Claude Juncker has to say on Thursday. I promise you, he will be going hell-bent for deeper centralisation. To them, over here, it's a religion. Let's go to Leicester and speak to Dan. Good evening, Dan.
Hi, Nigel.
So, why is Europe increasingly rebelling against the European project?
I think for two reasons. Firstly, because the European project has shouldered a lot of the blame for the stagnation in lifestyle that's happened since the 2008 financial crisis. And secondly, because I think there's a widespread misunderstanding of what the European project really is these days.
All right, Dan. In a word, tell us, what is the European project these days?
So the EU these days is an economic bloc designed to try and compete with China.
It thinks that economically it can compete with China. It hopes militarily it can compete with America, which is a bit Walter Mitty to me, but hey. And what it's about, Dan, is the creation of the world's global superpower.
Well, the future is in superpowers, and probably economic superpowers as much as anything else.
Do you really think so? Do you really think so? Do you really think that people? I mean, if the peoples of Europe wanted to be in the United States of Europe, and they'd been told from the start that's what it was about, if they'd accepted it, people like me wouldn't exist. Isn't the problem, Dan, this has been done to them without anybody ever really being told the truth?
Well, in this case, it's been done to them because people have never really taken an interest until recently. People on the continent are a lot wiser about what's going on in Europe because they have to be, I guess. They're on the same landmass. But
well, I see. I mean, again,
China.
Again, Dan, if you said to people in Europe, do you want a cooperative structure in Europe? Do you want to trade together, cooperate together, have reciprocity, and maybe even common standards on a range of things? I think, Dan, people would say yes. But they actually increasingly are saying they want the nation state to be the building block that they respect.
Well, I think the cultural element of a nation state has always got to be respected, but the free movement of capital and labour and therefore people is necessary in order for the EU to compete. It's not an option, not an optional thing. You have to be able to move capital and people around in order to compete, and the rise of China makes it's not even a matter of choice. The future because China
maybe Dan, if the European Union hadn't expanded, letting countries where minimum wages were a sixth of what they were in other countries, maybe if they hadn't made these huge mistakes of letting Greece and others into the euro, maybe they wouldn't be facing this huge crisis.
Well, they kind of had to let Greece and the others into the euro because part of competing with China is driving down Western European wages to match.
Well, I tell you what, Dan, you may be right, but if they do think they can compete against China economically or America militarily, it ain't going to happen. Now let's finish on a happy note. Some of you may know I am a cricket nut. It's the 5th test today. We are surprisingly on the verge of winning this series against India 4-1, which of itself is pretty remarkable. But big thing today, Alistair Cook's last day in cricket. He's finished up as the 5th highest run scorer in the history of Test cricket, the highest run scorer ever for England, 33 centuries. His first Test innings, he scored 100. His last Test innings, he scored 100. Here he was at the Oval today as he was dismissed for 147 runs.
Oh, he's nicked that, hasn't he? He has. And for one final time, Alistair Cook has been dismissed in international cricket. Every single Indian player to a man congratulates Cook. For one final time, a long, lonely walk back to the dressing rooms for Alistair Cook. But this time, he goes with the thanks of a cricketing nation.
And not just a great cricketer, but a gentleman and somebody very modest in the way that he went about things. A wonderful, wonderful man. I've had the privilege of meeting him a couple of times. Right, I'm done. I'm finished. Tom Swarbrick at 10, but now it's Ian Dale.
It's because he comes from Essex, Nigel, that's why.
I know he does. He's one of your best ever products, Ian.
He absolutely is, along with Graham Gooch. Nigel, thank you very much.